Here's Rick Wiles talking to Gordon Thomas about his latest book at that time, Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy.
Gordon Thomas, the award-winning, internationally acclaimed author of numerous books on intelligence agencies and espionage, along with his co-worker, Martin Dillon, have just completed the publication of an absolutely incredible book on the life and death of Robert Maxwell. The book is entitled Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy, The Life and Murder of a Media Mogul. This book is absolutely, it is riveting. It is, you can't put this book down because Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon bring to the pages of this book intricate details about the involvement of Robert Maxwell with the Israeli Mossad spy agency, and they show how it was the Mossad who put an end to Robert Maxwell's career. On the telephone with me right now from his home in Ireland is the author, the co-author of this book, Gordon Thomas. Gordon, welcome back to American Freedom News.
Wonderful to be back again.
Oh, Gordon, I'll tell you, I can't put this book down. This is fascinating book. You've outdone yourself. What is this? Your 40th book? 45th?
Yeah, it's the 40th. Yep. She's running away in England. We've gone through 6 reprints in 4 weeks, and it's done about 27,000 copies in the States, which is pretty good in this climate. But I think the attraction is not, Chris, is not that it's just a story of Maxwell, but it is. It's one of the greatest thrillers I've ever encountered in my whole life, because many years ago I briefly worked for Maxwell as one of his reporters in his vast newspaper empire, and he was an absolute monster. And I remember, and this is the man who made off with hundreds of millions, by the way. I remember him coming down the editorial floor of the Daily Mirror and raging. He was holding up an expense sheet of some hapless reporter who he discovered had cheated him by all of 50 cents. And this reporter was fired on the spot. Now, what made it particularly poignant, of course, it was the day before Christmas Eve. You imagine, he says, "And a happy Christmas to you," and threw him out. He was extraordinary, Maxwell. He was bizarre.
Over 50 cents, he fired a reporter over 50 cents, and yet Maxwell himself stole hundreds of millions of dollars from his investors.
And at the time, he was in the middle of stealing left, right, and center. But none of us suspected at the time, of course, that Maxwell was this super spy for Israel. And I think that's what's going to shake people, because one of the things that was so shattering when we were doing it, when Martin and I were doing our research, was to discover how he had taken Senator John Tower, who was, as you know, a powerful figure within the Republican Party, and had used him as his gopher.
I was stunned when I read this in the book. Martin or Gordon, before we get into these really juicy details about Robert Maxwell, for the benefit of our listeners who may not know very much about Robert Maxwell, give them a brief history of Robert Maxwell's financial empire and the influence that this man had back in the 70s and 80s and the early 90s, just before he died.
Well, Maxwell was without a doubt Citizen Kane writ large. He envisaged that he would one day be greater than Rupert Murdoch. He saw himself as the natural successor to Hearst, William Randolph Hearst. He imagined he would conquer the world, and what he did, he began in the most modest way possible, barefoot, in a little village in the depths of the Balkans. He rose, having created for himself already a legend, all fantasy, about his wartime experiences, until he really became a war hero. It's sort of art imitating fact, in fact. And he became quite a good war hero in World War II. And then, because he spoke all these many languages, he spoke 8 languages fluently, he saw an opening for himself after World War II, which was in publishing. And very shrewdly, he acquired all the rights to a large number of German periodicals, which were scientific periodicals, which were really very advanced. And he republished these in England and in America and elsewhere. And he founded his fortune. It became Pergamon Press, which became perhaps one of the biggest scientific publishing houses in Britain. He then rose and he became a member of the British Parliament. he became an incredible salesman, and that became very important later. He could sell anybody anything, and of course, finally, he got his hands on the Daily Mirror, which was the flagship of the tabloid world in Britain. And he turned it into what became laughingly known as the Daily Maxwell, because pretty well every day he had his photograph on the front page with an editorial about this, that, and t'other. But nobody realized at this time this is only part of his extraordinary existence, because he was, without a doubt, very successful as a publisher, and he published a stream of bestsellers. He published a massive amount of scientific journals. He also saw the Mirror circulation climb and climb and climb. And you would have thought you'd been satisfied with that, but no. He had made in his heart of hearts a commitment that Israel for him was to be a spiritual home, even though he had a British passport, even though he'd served in the British Army and so on. And so when he was approached by Mossad, because, you see, at that time we had the Cold War at full blast, and Maxwell was the only person who could walk into the Kremlin, could walk into anywhere in Eastern Europe through his languages, through his connections, through his publishing, everything else. And he became a natural target for Mossad to wish to recruit. And what they did, they offered him, would he work for them, not as a spy like we think of James Bond, but as just about the best door opener they would ever hope to have. And he said, no problem, he would do that. And so Robert Maxwell set about opening every possible door and learning every secret he could by doing so. He could walk into Downing Street, the home of Britain's Prime Minister. He became a close friend of Ronald Reagan. He could walk into the Oval Office, and where others would have to wait their turn to go and see the president, he could just browse in. Absolutely unbelievable. And he knew everybody. And if you look at his library of photographs, and it is a library, literally there's walls of photographs of him, with every famous figure in the world. So this man knew everybody.
Gordon, with this man's multi-billion-dollar empire, was part of his empire financed by the Rothschild banking empire?
No, he wanted them to. Yes, it was. Yes. Short answer, yes. He had, pretty well every major bank in the world, particularly in America and Britain, Rothschilds included, of course. They all poured money into him. They were throwing money at him, and he was using it to buy extraordinary things. For instance, he spent $2 billion to buy the Macmillan Publishing Corporation in New York. He spent $700 million to buy the Airline Guide and so on. But sometimes his buying went wrong and he lost. And almost like the Wall Street crash in 1929, he didn't always calculate rightly because he wouldn't listen to anybody. He would do it on impulse. He was a very impulsive man. So there he was, buying and selling, and by the time he was fully fledged as an operative for the Israeli Mossad, he had something like 400 companies under his absolute control. He was always the principal shareholder. He bought the Daily News in New York. He bought this famous yacht, which became central to our story, the Lady Ghislaine, which he named after his daughter. He bought, but what was so important is what he bought and set up in the Balkans, Central Europe. He became known as the King of Bulgaria because there he behaved like a king. And it was there that he indulged all his fantasies, both his business fantasies and his sexual fantasies. And it was there that he met people like Fidel Castro. It was there that he met the head of the KGB at the time, called Khrushchev, Vladimir Khrushchev. And it was there that he became finally the bagman for organized crime families in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, who also had connections to the Gotti family in New York and so on. And so Maxwell became the bagman, the money man for these crime families. And he moved money around the world, billions at the toss of a hat, just like that. Boom.
Gordon, he also played extremely important roles in the release of Jews from Russia and
He did.
Eastern Europe to be transported to Israel. Tell us about some of these deals, how they were made. These are deals that he would make with the Russians in exchange for favors.
Yeah, essentially what would happen, he was able to persuade the Russians, that was his prime job, to help Israel get these Jews out of the Soviet Union. And he moved 30,000 and more at a time. And in return, he provided the Russians with, his particular friends in the KGB and what have you, with the most lavish gifts. He used their banks. He also became very, very close to the Politburo and so on. Now, this information was priceless to Mossad because he persuaded the Russians to allow him to bring into the Soviet Union his computers from his factories. He had a large number of businesses making and selling computers. He began to set up this complete network of interrelated companies which were targeted at moving into the West and stealing our technology, which he knew about and took part in because he was director of many of these companies. And his job was he walked both sides of the fence almost, of the road. He was extraordinary. I mean, one day he would be with President Reagan in the White House. The next day he would be in the Kremlin doing a deal which would be in favor of Israel. And I remember what David Kimchi, the former deputy director of Mossad, told me. He said, Robert Maxwell had one philosophy. It was Israel first, last, and always. And never forget that when you write about him. He was, for us, a great patriot. And that was so, but therefore you may wonder, well, why did they have to get rid of him? Well, what happened? Maxwell became more and more in love with himself, I suppose, with his power, his authority, his connections. Nobody he felt could dare challenge him, dare say no to him. He once said, prime ministers come and go, presidents come and go, but I'll be here forever. And so what happened? On that premise, he was approached by Vladimir Khrushchev of the KGB to ask him if he would assist in a plot to overthrow Mikhail Gorbachev, who had taken power in Russia and was bringing democracy, perestroika, into that devastated country. And Maxwell thought, where's the deal for me here? And they said, well, you can handle the national debt if we pull this off. And that would have meant a very good take for him because he was on 15% of everything he could get on that. So he went to Israel and he said to his friends at Mossad, how about this? Shall we get involved? We should get involved, he kept saying. And he outlined what the plan was. What he hadn't realized, he had totally miscalculated one thing. There were those high up in the Israeli government and in Mossad who were horrified at the idea that anybody would want to remove Gorbachev because it would immediately bring them into confrontation with the United States. America saw Gorbachev as the only possible hope for salvation in the Soviet Union, which was, a powerful threat. They fought against it still, though in fact it wasn't that powerful a threat as we were to discover. And the idea of overthrowing Gorbachev and probably assassinating him, with Israel being implicated through Maxwell, or perhaps even worse, implicated through other forces, horrified them, and they thought Maxwell has gone a step too far. At the same time, he was running out of banks. He was borrowing and spending and losing, and his once powerful newspaper empire was beginning to totter, partly due to union troubles. He couldn't stave off huge expenses, never mind the 50 cents that poor reporter, but he was running into huge bills, printing difficulties, all the things that we've seen Murdoch deal with and overcome successfully, I think. Maxwell couldn't, and he was losing money. Money was pouring out.
I believe you pointed out in your book that at the time of his decline, he was about $2.2 billion in the red, and his creditors really didn't know how bad it was. They just, each of the creditors knew that they were losing money, but nobody really knew how how deeply in debt Maxwell's empire was running at the time. And so Maxwell, according to your book, Maxwell was running scared. He knew he was sinking and sinking fast, and he had to come up with a way to get out of debt. So the pressure was on Maxwell to make a deal with somebody who could bail him out financially. Just recently, Gordon, I interviewed Mr. William Hamilton, the president of Inslaw, and we talked to him about how the Israeli Mossad stole his promised software.
That's right.
And you brought that out first in your book, Seeds of Fire. Now, what I didn't know until I read this new book, Robert Maxwell, Israel Superspy, was that Robert Maxwell basically was the salesman for Promise. He's the one who took it and marketed it around the world. Let's back up and talk about first how Israel got their hands on the Inslaw Promise software.
Well, it was the most brilliant coup pulled off by that most brilliant spy master of all, Rafi Eitan of Mossad. He, at the time, was in his late middle years, but extraordinary man. And you have to think of Rafi like a small tank, is the best way to describe him. He is physically so powerful. He has also got this amazing ability to change his appearance with just a minimum of disguise. I remember talking to him about this when I interviewed Rafi many times, and he's appeared in other books of mine with his spycraft and what have you. And he said, all this stuff about beards and all this stuff for disguise is all nonsense, he said. All you need to do, he said, is put cotton wadding in your cheeks or up your nose. You need to wear a pair of glasses. If you don't smoke, smoke. If you take a pipe, it's perfect. If you don't, use one. And that's it. And you may adopt a limp, he said. Now, the point is, he took on the guise, when he went to see Bill Hamilton at Inslaw, he took on the guise of a public prosecutor from Israel. What he'd done, he had got hold of this real public prosecutor's passport and just simply had his forgers slip Rafi's photograph into the passport. And he came, though he was wanted by U.S. Customs for questioning over other matters to do with intelligence operations against America, Rafi just bowled on through Kennedy Airport. Nobody spotted him. Nobody says, that looks like Rafi Eitan, because he had just nicely disguised himself. And he turned up at Inslaw, and he went in, and he asked to see how this might work, because at the time Inslaw was selling it, of course, as a piece of software to use by public prosecutors to track down criminals. And Rafi said there are plenty of these criminals, as you know, in Israel, unfortunately, laughing. He has this funny little laugh, which is not really a laugh. It's like a chilling breeze that goes past you as it comes out of his mouth. And Bill Hamilton and Nancy Burke Hamilton and his small staff were totally taken in by Rafi. And he sat down, he had his tea with them and all that stuff. And only when he left, as Bill told me, did he realize something strange about this guy, but he didn't know what. Well, Rafi went back, and with a brilliant ploy, he went back to see his contact at the Justice Department, because he had facilitated justice to get him into America by simply saying he was coming from the public prosecutor's office in Israel and would like to see the software he'd heard about. So he goes back, and he goes into the office of a man called Brewster, who is in charge of liaison with Inslaw, which is Hamilton's company. And Rafi says, so Bruce said, how did it go? And Rafi says, wonderful, very interesting. He says, oh, my God, he said, I forgot something. And Bruce said politely, what did you forget? He said, I forgot to ask Mr. Hamilton for a copy of his software. Now, Rafi knew instinctively if he'd asked Bill for that copy, he would never have got it, of course, because Bill wasn't going to part with that priceless software of his. Brewster said, no problem, Mr. The name he'd given as a public prosecutor, no problem. And he gave him a copy. And Rafi said to me, sometimes you don't have to work very hard to pull something off. And that's how he got it. And he goes back to Israel. Now,
a Justice Department official just literally handed to one of the top Mossad agents handed the promised software.
Absolutely. And this, of course, has become a matter of huge grief for Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton and Inslaw. And as you know, they are still battling through the courts to get justice for themselves without any success so far. But Rafi goes back to Israel, and he recognizes, well, I just can't lift this as it is. I need to do something more than that. And he sits down with that other rogue of the story, who is Ari Ben Menashe, who'd worked for him. And Ari Ben Menashe had been a very senior intelligence officer who had fallen foul of the Israeli intelligence establishment and was now outside the loop, so to speak. Well, they sat down, and Rafi sat there and said, what do we need, what do we need? He said, I know what we need. We'll deconstruct this, take it apart, rebuild it, but nobody can ever accuse us of stealing it because it'll look different. So his people took time to do that. They did it, but they then said, we need something else, Rafi said. We need to know what people are doing with this. And he said, I know what we need, a trapdoor. Now, this trapdoor would not be a trapdoor like we think of a trapdoor falling through. It would be a piece of something inserted in the software, which to this day, people don't know. They've tried to find it. It's amazing. What it does, it's a little device which goes into this piece of software. And if you take the thing apart, the device just goes, gone. And the Israelis said, we can do it, but we shouldn't build a trapdoor here because it may be traced by the CIA, who are good at this, or the British intelligence, who are equally good, traced back to us, and then we have a problem. We need to be absolutely undetectable. So Ari Ben Menashe said, I know a place. And he came to California, and he talked to this guy he'd known some years ago who ran a little company in California, and he persuaded him to build the trapdoor. He gave him $5,000 in cash for it. And the guy said, I know it's no question time, but is this for Mossad? And Ari said to him, as he told me, you're right, it's no question time, and laughed and walked away. Now, they installed the trapdoor, then they had to test it. And so they went to another element in this story, a man called Earl Bryan, who's now doing time in a penitentiary for mass fraud and what have you. And Earl Bryan had been very close to President Reagan and had, in fact, worked for him.
And actually, Gordon, I worked for a brief period of time for Earl Bryan.
Right. So you know a bit
about him. Back in the 80s, yes, I do. I worked for him just before he went to prison.
Right.
He owned several television networks back
That's
then.
right.
He owned the Learning Channel, and he owned...
he's a clever guy, no question.
Oh, the Financial News channel that later was sold to CNBC.
Well, that's the man. Well, now, what happened? At the time, he had a company called Hadron. And this company was a specialist company, so Rafi used this company to test out if the trapdoor would work. And they ran the test against their neighbor, Jordanian intelligence, and it did work. But both Ari Ben Menashe and Rafi Eitan came to the same conclusion very quickly. Earl Bryan, for all his brilliance and willingness and all this stuff, did not have the resources that they wanted. And they said one word. Robert said, Ben Menashe, and Rafi completed, yep, Maxwell. He's the man. So Maxwell was hauled in, and he immediately saw for himself this was a wonderful chance to make money. And he didn't understand software at that stage, but my goodness me, he was on a fast learning curve. And he set off to sell Promise, which was the name of the software. And the ironic thing is, and the cheeky thing is, that Rafi Eitan decided, and this is what really, really does tick off poor old Bill Hamilton, is this. Rafi Eitan decided, I'll keep that name Promise. It's such a good name for selling. And so he stole it. Not he stole the name as well.
And he actually sold it as Promise.
Oh, yeah, it's still sold as Promise. Now, he went off around the world. Maxwell then became not just super spy, but ultra super salesman. He went off round the world, and he pulled it off brilliantly.
Gordon, briefly explain to our listeners why Mossad wanted Maxwell to sell this PROMIS software to other government agencies around the world. He sold it, I guess, to Canada and European nations. What was Mossad's hidden motive in getting this PROMIS software into the government computers of other nations?
Well, very simply, it gave Mossad an inside track view of what was happening when everybody was using PROMIS. Sitting in Tel Aviv, Rafi Atan and his technicians would know exactly what was going on in those departments, in those people using it. For instance, excuse me. For instance, when they were he saw, and by the way, Atan didn't just say the government's big, but government's small. For instance, he went to his first client was Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, and he told Mugabe how to use it to track why farmers who may be plotting against him. It's very simple how it works, yet very, very complex. With a piece of paper, once, I'm sure Bill Hamilton has said it much better than me, but with a single piece of paper, you can pretty well track anybody, that person's life, where he's done, his phone calls and so on. It's like a never-widening ripple that goes on, and the information is just priceless when it comes back, because it's all sorted and coded for you and decoded and so on. Well, what he was able to do, by selling it, for instance, he would go to the Russians and say, you need this to keep track of what your little friends in the Soviet satellites are doing, and Croesus said, you're absolutely right. And Maxwell would demonstrate it, and the Russians, KGB, would have it. But what they didn't realize, sitting in Tel Aviv, there were people listening to what the KGB were doing. It became extraordinary because Maxwell enabled the Israelis, who survived by the simple premise that knowledge is all, and the more knowledge, the more all-powerful you are. They were able to listen into the Syrians. Maxwell sold it at cut-price lots to the Egyptians. He sold it everywhere.
I have a feeling, Gordon, that this PROMIS, the early version of PROMIS, I have a feeling that it is most likely the foundation for DARPA's new Total Information Awareness data mining program that Poindexter's setting up in the Pentagon. Because
I have no doubt.
That's what they're going to do. They're going to track every electronic transaction and communication of every person in the United States. And I just have a good feeling that PROMIS was the foundation for this Super Snoop software.
It was, and the ironic thing is this: Mr. Hansen, the renegade rogue FBI agent, he passed it to his Russian Soviet controller, Russian controllers rather, and he got money for it, of course. And they sold it to bin Laden. And I have just done an op-ed piece on this, because today bin Laden has survived because, and Hamilton has confirmed this to me as well, because he has a version of PROMIS which enables him to be ahead of us when we're looking for him. You see, the advantage is, with this PROMIS system, you can do the most astonishing things, and this is a terrifying thing. I'm sure Bill Hamilton told you this, how efficient it is. It is reckoned to be, within the intelligence world, perhaps the most priceless piece of software ever created, and it's still so valuable today. But bin Laden has a copy now. Now, Hansen sold it to the BMD, which is German external intelligence. They only became suspicious something wrong was with it only after 9/11, when they realized that something was happening to their intelligence intercepts. And they said, we don't know, but we think there's something wrong here. And it was, of course, another version of the trapdoor. Because after Maxwell had sold it everywhere, news of the trapdoor leaked in Canada, when Ben Menashe, who lives in Montreal, was picked up and questioned about this and his involvement.
Gordon, was the CIA aware of the trapdoor? Or
Not
was
initially, because they were building their own version of PROMIS, which they'd also got from Justice.
So this went for years with only the Israeli Mossad knowing about the trapdoor.
Yeah.
One of the things that's in this book that just really opened my eyes, stunned me, was Gordon's revelation of the relationship between Robert Maxwell and former Texas U.S. Senator John Tower, who was at one time probably the most powerful member of the U.S. Senate. Gordon, but let's talk about John Tower's involvement. How did Tower get involved with Robert Maxwell, and what did Maxwell use Tower to do?
Well, originally, Israel arranged for Henry Kissinger to facilitate the introduction to Tower. Maxwell wanted Tower for Israel to be his door opener into the Reagan administration, and more important of all, to be his door opener into the nuclear arsenal of America, which was Los Alamos. Tower, at the time, as you know, had just retired from his post as chairman of the Senate Armed Forces Committee. He knew everybody in the intelligence forces everywhere. And so Maxwell struck a deal with Tower. He would pay him $200,000 a year, plus wonderful bonuses in any currency he wanted, at any bank he wanted in the world, because Maxwell had banks everywhere. And in fact, Tower became his door opener. So Israel had a door opener in Maxwell. Maxwell had a door opener in Tower. Tower became the man who would usher in Robert Maxwell in to see Reagan, Attorney General Meese, anybody he wanted. And it was Tower who finally and speedily arranged for Robert Maxwell to sell a doctored version of Promise with the trapdoor to the Sandia Laboratories in Los Alamos.
Tower, wait a minute. John Tower, former senator of Texas, helped Robert Maxwell to sell the Promise software with the Israeli Mossad trapdoor to our nuclear laboratory at Los Alamos, which gave the Israelis a window into Los Alamos.
Correct, and we substantiate every word of that by the FBI documents we have obtained with the help of Bill Hamilton, and we've obtained elsewhere, which show exactly how the FBI had tried to track this, and we detail how the then director of the FBI found his moves blocked, almost certainly from the White House, almost certainly with people at the level of Bill Casey of the CIA, Weinberger, and people like that. A lot of people suddenly decided it was not a good idea to have this investigation into how Maxwell had got into Los Alamos. And that's very frightening because, in fact, it was Tower, his influence, his power still, that blocked off the investigation.
Gordon, at that time, was it William Webster who was FBI?
William Webster was the head of the FBI.
And so Webster was onto this scandal, and he was trying to investigate the Israeli Mossad penetration of Los Alamos, but high-level Reagan White House operatives blocked the FBI investigation.
That's right, and to this day it's blocked, and it's amazing, because to this day you will never get to the bottom of that. I mean, there's been many attempts, and we've come as close as anybody, I think, in what we've detailed. But, it was extraordinary because we have actually his pitch speech, Maxwell's pitch speech to Sandia, which is marvelous. It's a wonderful piece of theater he puts himself through. And the result is he sells the document, he sells it, and it's in there. Now, what happened was that when the FBI became suspicious, having been alerted by their field stations, they're blocked off, and they can't do anything. And Maxwell got away with that with the help of Tower. Tower was so extraordinary because Tower gave additional respectability to Maxwell's kind of cover.
Was John Tower aware of the hidden motive of Robert Maxwell?
Oh, yeah. There's no question about it. John Tower knew, and John Tower took the Maxwell dollar, if you like, or the Maxwell shilling.
So you're saying John Tower, he was a traitor to the United States of America.
You could say that in the simplest way. He was a traitor in that sense.
But this guy was a right-wing Republican U.S. senator from the state of Texas, and he sold us down the river.
Yep, and the point is, he did it because he was greedy
and a drunk. And he had a reputation for hard living and drinking. That was one reason I think his nomination was turned down as Secretary of Defense. Right. They tried to get him into the Defense Department.
Yes. He became, next to Maxwell, a priceless asset for Mossad because he would tell Maxwell everything. Maxwell would feed straight back to Tel Aviv. Maxwell took him to Bulgaria. He took him to Central Europe. He took him everywhere. And so Tower all the time was talking because he did have a serious problem with young girls and heavy booze. And Maxwell used all this. And Tower is, to me, as much a traitor as anybody else I've come across in a long time in the history of America. They won't like this, the Republicans, but the fact is he was, and he was very dangerous. And what he's done, we'll never know how much Mossad owe to Tower because it's one of the things we'll never know. But all this, against this background, you see, having achieved these remarkable things, Maxwell rather, he thought he was unstoppable. And so when his money problems became ones that banks were no longer prepared to handle, he went to Mossad. He said, I want $400 million right now, U.S. dollars. And they said, look, go to the banks. Do what Rupert Murdoch did. And he says, you don't tell me what to do. I want the money now.
Now, you're talking about at this point in when Maxwell started to run out of money. His empire was just $2 billion in debt. He goes to Mossad. He says, I'm broke. I need money. And Mossad needs to come up with the money.
That's right. You see, his repayment, his interest was $300 million a year. You think of that. Just interest payments. He couldn't keep up with them. And he was juggling day and night. And, you know, and he wanted...
So Mossad told him, just do what Rupert Murdoch did. Go to your bankers, plead mercy, and ask them to refinance. But
that's right.
But Maxwell was too arrogant, too proud.
Absolutely right.
And so he began to threaten Mossad.
He did indeed. And you see, he'd also lost the wise counsel in some ways of Tower. Tower was by then dead in a mysterious plane crash. Now, one of the interesting things we discovered in our investigation, how many people around Maxwell who were quite key have all died mysteriously. We have a whole section on that. If anyone wants to read a thriller about how people die mysteriously, have a look at that section. It's quite scary.
I forgot about John Tower dying in a plane crash.
That's right.
Do you have any clues on what happened there?
Well, you'll see what Maxwell says. We have the direct transcript of what he says. He says, who knows? It might have been ... But Maxwell was then worried because we discover from his staff, and by the way, we sourced over 100 people, directly, so it's not a question of making this up in any sense. It's all there, all on transcript, all on tape and everything else. And he starts to pressurize the one people who can't pressurize, Mossad. And the result is they said he has to go. And the last part of the book is a textbook of how you put together the perfect assassination.
Well, basically, Mossad became afraid that a desperate, financially desperate Maxwell was going to double-cross them, backstab them, and began to, with his media empire, he was going to begin to expose Mossad activities as extortion against Mossad to get the money. So Mossad said, we got to put this guy out of business. We're going to have to, we need to bump this guy off. So tell us, we only have a few minutes here, tell us about this top secret Israeli Mossad assassination team and this elaborate plan to kill Robert Maxwell.
Well, first of all, they spent weeks researching. They put together a team. It's called a Kidon unit. Kidon means bayonet, and it isn't a very appropriate team. It's the only assassination team in any intelligence agency in the world which works full-time only on killing people. And it's still in existence today, and it's killed dozens since Maxwell. But its job in this case was to carry out the perfect assassination that looked like an accident. So they looked at a number of quick ideas they could do. First, could they break his elevator and let him fall as he came out of his high-rise apartment? No, there's a risk that he might have other people in the elevator and kill them. Secondly, could they sabotage one of his aircraft? They could make it look like a crash, like perhaps John Tower died in a mysterious way, but then there'd be other people on the plane as well. They finally decided the only way to kill him was at sea, as if he drowned. And so they studied him physically, they studied him mentally, and they studied everything. And what they did, they put the 4-man team together, and they had a drug, a lethal nerve agent, which the team was to inject into his neck. First, they had to get him on deck alone. So they concocted a scheme. They said to him, all right, they called him up in London and said, look, okay, we said no to your money. Okay, tell you what we do. You come to the Canary Islands in the Atlantic on your boat, and we'll tell you what to do. So, and he said, do I get the money? He said, we'll tell you what to do. Relax. So he set sail from Gibraltar out to sea in the Atlantic, and he's moved here and there. And it's a wonderful example of how Mossad really do plan and plot. And they put an electronic net over the whole area so there could be they would know everything, signals coming from the boat to the boat. They'd know everything. There'd be no mystery for them. And then the four-man team set off in their own boat, and they waited until they got their instructions. Maxwell was then told in what he thought was a call emanating from Tel Aviv. It wasn't. It was coming from one of the backup boats that the Mossad had in the area. And it told Maxwell to be on deck in the early hours of that morning, and that he was to wait there on the port side, and he was to make sure the deck was empty, and they would hand him his money order. And they said, now, you understand, Robert, when you've got this money, that's it. You don't come anymore. You just understand that, okay? And he was so good. He said, absolutely understood. Of course, 400 miles. Wow, terrific, no problem. Well, it went clockwork smooth because they'd rehearsed it. They came alongside, and you have to think of the boat. A boat is a very large boat. It's not a little rowing boat. All the crew were mostly on sleep watch. There was only a minimal crew on the bridge, and they were peering forward anyway. Where Maxwell was told to stand was right at the aft, and they came up on the opposite side of the boat. The boat was traveling. It's a big, powerful boat, and they were able to scramble on board because they, were trained for that. They came on board across the deck, jabbed him in the neck, lowered him into the water, still alive, and then they drowned him as if he'd fallen over the side. Now, all this is in the last 100 or so pages that we deal with, and we would never have been able to prove this and show it if we had not got the original autopsy reports from Spain, from Dr. Ian West, and from Israel. Now, these were given to us by Betty Maxwell, the widow, and Isabel Maxwell, Robert's twin daughter. The other twin, of course, is Ghislaine, from whom the boat was named. And it was these people who finally decided the time had come, the truth had to be told. And the result was the story we have, the murder of Robert Maxwell.
Oh, Gordon, an incredible story, incredible work of research, and I appreciate you taking time today to call us from your home in Ireland and tell us this untold story about the murder of Robert Maxwell, Israel's super spy.